you think about it, Fed funds, who borrows at Fed funds? Do you borrow at Fed funds? Do I borrow at Fed funds? No. Banks borrow at Fed funds. And what do banks do? They borrow at Fed funds. They buy treasuries because no one else would buy treasuries, because who would buy bonds of an over-indebted country that's issuing trillions of dollars of deficit every year? No one. So there has to be someone to buy it. So the Fed has bought all they can through QE. So they lend money to the banks and the banks buy them. That's actually a riskless trade, right? JP Morgan last year had 0 negative trading days. That's impossible if you're actually trading, right? No one's that good. But if you borrow and invest in a riskless trade, that's a pretty good deal. And you lever it up 11, 12 times, you're good. So the Fed, since 2009, reliquefied the banks. Now, despite reliquefying the banks, the bank stocks are still falling. Why are they still falling? Well, because people have realized in zero interest rate world, or worse, negative interest rate world, the banking system breaks down. And then you look at Japanese banks for the last 20 years, they've gone down. European banks for the last 16 years, gone down. US banks are going to keep going down. And there's lots of reasons why that's going to happen. So the Fed's doing their job. They're trying to protect the banks and non-bank financial institutions, Citadel, Millennium, Bridgewater, all these other non-bank financial institutions that are now too big to fail. So I'll say the Fed's doing what the Fed has to do. Full stop, I don't like it. I don't think it's that effective. And I think the market last Monday was proof, right? The Fed says we're going to lower interest rates all the way to 0 overnight, Sunday, emergency, after the emergency 50 basis point rate cut the week before. And the market still went down 10% that morning, or 9% that morning. So I think people realize that the Fed has lost credibility. I call it, hashtag Fed in a box. They have no choice but to do what they're doing. And they're going to print as much money as necessary to keep the system liquid. But therein lies the problem. We don't have a liquidity crisis. We have a solvency crisis, or a potential solvency crisis. And just like in 2009, liquidity can't solve a solvency crisis. And the problem is we need a raft of bankruptcies to occur and cleanse the bad companies. So that's where the fiscal comes in. So now, as of this afternoon, I guess, we're going to have this giant save bailout plan where we're going to hand money to malfeasant CEOs and corporations who have frittered away their competitive advantage by not investing in R&D, not investing in people, not investing in property, plant, and equipment, not saving for a rainy day, levering up and buying back their stock because they needed to feed the beast of QE. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the Fed is not allowed by law to buy stocks. Well, the only buyers of stocks over the last 3 or 4 years have been buybacks. Why? Well, because the boomers, myself and all my brethren and sisterin, right, 10,000 of us turn 65 every day. I still got 8 years to go. But every day, 10,000 of us turn 65. And another 10,000 of us turn 71 and a half. And at 71 and a half, you have to withdraw from your retirement. And so $1 trillion has to come out over the next 17 years. Each year, that's 17 trillion with a T, has to come out of stocks, some bonds, but mostly stocks, out of 401k plans and retirement plans. So that was a negative drag. It also turns out that 65 to 85-year-old people don't like stocks. They like bonds. And other than Mario Gabelli, who took the picture of him buying green bananas yesterday on Twitter, legend, by the way, Mario's awesome. Most people don't really want to plan for the future. They want the now. They want to have money now. So there's demand for stocks went down other than buybacks. Well, why did buybacks go up? Well, the Fed, unlike the Bank of Japan or the Swiss National Bank, which are allowed to buy stocks, isn't allowed to buy stocks. So what they did is they cut a deal. They called all the corporate chieftains, and Buffett, anything that Buffett owned was now suddenly going to be given a massive tax cut. In exchange, you can't do R&D, you can't buy new facilities, you can't hire more people, you have to buy back your stock. And so Apple, my favorite one to pick on, has the same profits as 2015, yet their earnings per share, quote unquote, air quotes, is up 20% because they retired a bunch of shares. Well, who bought Apple 5 years ago? Oh, Warren Buffett. But he said he hates tech stocks. Well, they're not a tech stock anymore. They're a mature business that is milking a cash cow and buying back their stock to fabricate artificial earnings growth. So you have that happening all over. I call it stealth QE. That now stops because prices are falling. So now you got the last buyer of stocks gone. Companies are flailing, and they're saying, well, now you got to help me, government. So what does the government do? Whoever paid the most into lobbying is getting the biggest check. And I thought the great calculation someone put out there is, if you just divided the total number by the total number of people in the US, excluded babies and just talked about adults, it's about 58,000 per household. We're getting checks for $1,200 each plus $500 for our kids, 3.14 people. That's about $2,900. Where's that difference from 58,000 and 2,900 going? Oh, Wall Street executives, hedge fund managers, and people like BlackRock who are going to get to manage these big funds that are created. Call me cynical, but I think that sucks.
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting kind of as we go through these economic cycles is the people who are hurting the most, right? And I think where I have the biggest problem is the everyday American citizen and the small business. A lot of this economic cycle, they don't even have a fighting chance, right? If you think of what the government basically did is they said, you have to shut down. And so, if I walk down the street in New York City and we're talking 70+% of the businesses are closed, right? And it's not because the economic cycle got so bad that they couldn't survive, or it's not that, we have a little bit less demand and we just mismanaged our cash. It's that, no, the government mandated that I shut down. And therefore I went from whatever revenue I had to zero overnight. Of course, I have to fire my staff. I can't survive, et cetera. But what's hilarious to me is at the same time that the small businesses are getting shut down and not really getting nearly as much relief, the companies that are getting these huge bailouts, they're still operating. The airlines are still flying.
Yes.
Now there's less demand, right? There's all these issues, but the government didn't shut them down. And so it just feels like there's a mismatch both in the treatment of who has to shut down and who doesn't. And then on top of that, who's getting what in these bailout packages or these relief packages.
Look, you're tempting me to go down my rabbit hole and I even tweeted or retweeted one of your tweets today with this, that if we assume that that's not the plan, then everything makes sense. Unfortunately, if we assume that the plan is, as I call it, hashtag dictator playbook, if the plan is to concentrate the assets in the few and impoverish the many and make them dependent on government, then everything's working just the way it's supposed to. And all these decisions make perfect sense if you view it from that perspective, as opposed to the perspective of we want to help as many people as possible. And people say, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would they want to do that? I said, well, let's think about the series of events that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. Everything has gone to this plan, right? They gave the fat cats, right, the corporate executives and corporate companies, the big tax cut. Middle class didn't get a big tax cut. The impoverished didn't get more help, didn't get more resources. We didn't increase lending for small business formation. In fact, we have the smallest rate of small business formation. Part of that's related to housing. Not as many people can afford housing, so there's not as much home equity, which is a big source of financing new businesses. So there's all these things that point to, wait a second, if I'm trying to consolidate wealth in my own family, in my friends, what we call crony capitalism, in the biggest contributors to my campaign, just to go completely down the rabbit hole for a second, someone said, it's weird that we haven't identified the companies that would provide the drug to combat COVID-19, and particularly ARDS, the advanced respiratory distress syndrome, which is, it's not the virus actually that's killing people, many of the people, it's actually the response, the immune response of the body to the virus itself, which actually can be controlled with this drug that Korea used to, lower their death rate, and other countries have used. And, my cynical view was, well, none of the drug companies were able to pay off the amount to be the sponsored drug. Back, if you go back to 2003, it was very interesting. Remember the anthrax scare, and we were all supposed to take Tamiflu. Well, it turns out the reason Tamiflu was, not Tamiflu, Cipro. The reason Cipro was stocked by the military, and everybody was supposed to stock up on Cipro, was Donald Rumsfeld was the chairman of that company. There are plenty of other companies that made similar type drugs, but Secretary of Defense was the chairman of the company. How does that work? So I think we're seeing many of the same problems today in that we have interested third parties, we have conflicted third parties, we have people making decisions based on their own pocketbook. And I actually believe, unfortunately, that the plan is just like in the 30s to create as much disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So the greatest income inequality in history up until last year was in 1929, 1930, right before the Depression. And it got worse during the Depression. Same thing I think is happening now, is we have this massive inequality. And if you actually push the economy into depression, and people say, that's ridiculous, that could never happen. I don't know. It's possible. Anything's possible. But if that actually is the plan, then what it does is it creates an environment where the rich stay in power, all the wealth flows up because they have to print money to devalue the currency, which inflates scarce assets like real estate, fine art, collectible cars, and stocks. Remember, 49% of people in America don't own stocks at all, right? Not only do they not own trading stocks, they don't own anything. They don't have a pension. They don't have a retirement account. They can't even come up with $400 to pay an emergency bill. And now you got restaurants who have 16 days of cash who have been forced to shut down. And I'll give you the example, and I shouldn't pick on this guy, but it just made me so angry when I watched him. So the commissioner of basketball gets up saying he's canceling the season. And he's looking so, social justice warrior, and I'm such a great guy. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, that's great. But what about all those vendors with all their hot dogs and hamburgers and Coca-Colas and T-shirts they've paid for? They're not going to be able to sell. Who's going to pay their rent? Who's going to keep them from being homeless? Who's going to pay their healthcare premiums? So now they don't have coverage. What if they actually get the virus? I mean, you could spiral into some really, really dark times, all on the account of, we want to slow the spread of this particular virus. But I'm like, wait a second. There are threats every single day. I said 23,000 people have died of influenza. A whole bunch of people. Here's a number most people don't know. 1.2 million people this year will die from tuberculosis globally. Not very many people in the US, but around the world, 1.2 million people. That's a lot of people. No one ever talks about shutting the economy down to stop the spread of tuberculosis. So I just think there's something else going on of why this is the thing that we chose to literally grind economic activity to a halt. And the problem with flywheels, right? Once the flywheel stops, it's really, really hard to get started again. And I think the economic damage is going to be really bad for a while.